Hi, in this short video series, we're going to talk a little bit about some best practices and sort of lessons learned on where you enable certain pieces of the framework, specifically within the game features, the use of action sets and experiences to kind of bring all of your design elements together in a sort of multi game mode framework that's easy to manage and debug. If you watch some of our earlier videos, I think we were a little loose in where we placed certain elements. And so this video is an attempt to share those lessons learned, give some practical tips on how to organize some stuff, and hopefully make your projects just that much easier to manage and debug. So let's start by taking a look at the intended experience. As part of our 3v3 video series, we were at the loot box stage, and we had to come back and look at how we created some components for the earlier Let's Make a series. All right. So let's look at how we want the experience to manifest itself when we're in game. So if we go into game, select a mode, and we select our building sandbox from our prior video series where we have a variety of action sets enabled. Let's actually turn bots off. As we load into that gameplay experience, if I were to pull up the inventory, I have all my persistent inventory from the database server. I can press L and pull up my skills and my abilities. You can see in the corner that I have my abilities. And so all of the more complex stuff, if I press B, I can bring up build mode and start building. So in this game experience, we have the full set of capabilities from all of the action sets. And if we go into options and we look at the mouse and keyboard, we'll see that the headings of the player mappable inputs, the default keyboard, the shooter action set adds those, inventory adds these two, ability now adds these, and then building adds both the building modes, the building controls, and the building action slots. And so in the full experience, all action sets result in the various inputs being mapped into the game mode. Now, if we go into our 3v3 game mode, where we have a different set of action sets, and let's select a character, we'll immediately notice that we don't have our abilities added in the bottom right-hand corner. We can press I to bring up our inventory. We cannot press B to do any building. And if we go into our keyboard settings, we'll see we still have our default keyboard, our shooter keyboard, and only our inventory inputs. And so the action sets are a good way to delineate different sets of capabilities by game mode. And so let's go back in and talk about that some more. All right, let's talk about some practical guidelines. These are by no means Epic endorsed thoughts. These are just from the experience of working with the Lyra project now for a bit of time and stumbling across some things that have caused challenges for us, particularly when you're trying to debug why a certain feature set is not working in your game mode and you're trying to figure out what's going on. We found that applying these general rules to where we activate certain elements has been helpful. So the first thing to look at is the game feature data asset. Now, there's one of these for every game feature that you create. It gets created as soon as you create the game feature. And the tendency would be to just dump everything in there. The challenge with that is as soon as you activate the game feature for whatever reason, all of those pieces are going to get initialized and started in your game. And it can be a bit daunting to figure out why something is active and where should I deactivate it, particularly since in many of these areas, you can choose to activate the exact same pieces. And so you might remove a piece from one area thinking it's disabled, only to find out it was enabled somewhere else. And so tracking down all the places where you may or may not have activated something becomes a problem. So our first guiding principle is the game feature for us does not do anything that will change the actual gameplay experience. It simply activates bits and pieces. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But things like the primary assets that an asset manager is aware of as a result of this game feature, we obviously have to configure that. The gameplay tags that are unique to this gameplay feature, the gameplay queue path, any data registration, any dependencies either for the game feature itself or the plugin if you're doing C++. All of those we would configure once and only once, and we do that in the game feature data. The real workhorse of our sort of mental model design is around the Lyra, it's actually the Lyra Experience Action Set, but LAS or the Lyra Action Set, is where we try to activate as many of the pieces that make logical sense. And we try to create Lyra action sets that are self-descriptive and modular in nature. So things like which game features are necessary, what components are required, what widgets are we activating, what abilities or ability sets are we going to give the player, what input bindings and input configurations. All of those can be set up and linked together in a Lyra action set, and a place where we found to be the most effective for long-term management and debugging purposes. Then you have the Lyra experience definition, where our general rule of thumb is to limit what we're activating in there to the action sets. If we've structured the action sets correctly, that should be self-evident and logical, and the components. And the components is the tricky one because components, you could argue, should reside in the Lyra action set. And I think there's a lot of good reasons from a modularity perspective to keep the components in the Lyra action set. The issue that you run into is when you have child components that may add incremental features or capabilities to parent components, and how do you keep the child-parent relationship going across action sets? And so we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But know that our general rule of thumb is that the components, we will try to lean into the Lyra experience for components, and then the rest of the experience is primarily just action sets. The other thing to note is that the Lyra pawn data, which is assigned as part of the experience definition, has two pieces that are not anywhere else in the data structures. One is the ability tag relationships, which allow you to block certain abilities when certain tags are active. That is only available on the Lyra pawn data. And the camera manager is also only available on the Lyra pawn data. So those two, we don't have them on the chart here, but those two elements, to the extent that you need them, are tied to the Lyra pawn data. And then finally, your user-facing experience, your modes and your maps, take that experience, the map and a loading screen, and bring that all together. So that's kind of our cheat sheet and handy reference for how we pull those pieces together. Let's dive a little bit deeper. All right, so the game feature data set. Like we said, we try to keep these so that the decisions that we make here enable certain foundational elements, but don't change gameplay. So by me turning on a game feature, no new input bindings, no new abilities, no new UI elements, nothing will change from the user perspective. It simply enables new sets of information for me to take advantage of. So if you think about the very simplest is if I have a bunch of new um, maps, I guess would be an example, right? I'd want to set up the primary asset for maps in the asset manager as part of the game feature. That's really the only place you can actually do that. If I define a new gameplay queue path, where I'm going to store a bunch of visual effects that get triggered by gameplay cues, I'll create the path here, but we won't actually execute that until we fire the gameplay cue, either from an ability or something in later down the chain. So any of these things that we set up here are sort of the prerequisites for using this gameplay feature sort of in the next set. And then the workhorse is that Lyra Action Set. And we believe as many action sets as necessary with a bias towards modularity, as these are good logical groupings of things that you can do anywhere else in the data structure, right? So you can put an input mapping anywhere. You can put an input mapping in the game feature. You can put an input mapping in the experience. You can put input mappings just about everywhere. If you do it that way, you can never figure out where the input mappings are. And there seems to be a very logical connection between the input mappings, the abilities, and if you think about like maybe an ability widget, right, a cooldown widget or an action bar item, those fit together quite nicely in that I want to define what key am I going to press, what ability is it going to trigger, what configuration in the player mapping abilities do I want. And so the Lyra Action Set really is a good way to represent a modular piece of code that takes advantage of all of those elements and bundles them together. Now, the downside of the Lyra Action Sets is there's no dependency in the action sets. By not having dependency, you have to know if one action set depends on another action set. Now, the upside of that is that it forces you to really think about dependencies and hopefully design better action sets that are more modular in nature and force you to think about your modularity better. So the downside and the upside are two sides of the same coin, but know that you do not have action set dependencies. They're unique and distinct. And the other thing to be cautious about is their relationship to any components. So a purist design would have the components in the action set so that everything is bucketed together in one action set. The flip of that, though, is that if you have a component and then you build a child of that component in a different action set, how do you manage whether you're attaching the parent or the child, that you don't end up attaching both by the way the action sets are set up? And so components are the one area where you need to spend a little more time thinking and a little more time planning your overall design to make sure that you don't end up with duplicate components, parent and child. I think the engine handles if you try to assign the exact same component twice, but the parent-child relationship is the one you need to think about. So if we look at that as an example, you can think about it as hiding all that complexity behind an action set. So in this example, we've got the inputs. So whether it's the input actions, the input mappings, or the player mappable inputs, all of those assets can be enabled inside an action set. Also, all of the abilities. So we tend to take our abilities, put those abilities into ability sets, and then put those sets into an action set. Again, there's no reason you can't just direct add an ability to an action set. But what we found is that by following a certain protocol of saying, okay, abilities will always be grouped into ability sets will always be added to an action set, and an action set will be added to an experience. It allows us to know innately where those things are and not get into situations where I add an ability set to an experience and then I go ahead and add the ability as well. And so as you're early in the Lyra, you might find yourself adding these things all over the place without a real distinct pattern. And what we found is abilities into an ability set into an action set, and that action set then into an experience. And therefore, we encapsulate a lot of that logic and simplify it so that when I'm looking at an experience, by just reading through the action sets, I know what that experience can do. All right, so that leads the Lyra experience definition, where, as I've said a couple of times, we try to focus on the action sets as being the self-descriptive definition of what the experience is. I've already talked a little bit about the components, and then the other thing you need to add in here is your Lyra pawn data, which defines your camera manager and your ability tags. The Lyra pawn data can also add other abilities, etc., but this is where we're choosing to avoid that from a simplicity perspective and from a maintenance perspective. So what you basically get out of this is, if you're hopefully taking anything away from this video, is that we use action sets a bit like Lego blocks. If I have the two experiences that we just showed you in the video, the one on the left being our 3v3, it has the inventory action set and the 3v3 specific action set. That's it. Other than components, that's all that lives in that experience. And so from a debugging perspective, it's easy to track down where things are being activated. On the right-hand side, we have our full persistent experience. And again, it has the inventory, but it also has abilities. It also has buildables, and then any of the specifics for the persistent world. And so just by reading through the action sets, I can get a pretty good understanding of what this Lyra experience will enable my player to do. And then I can just follow the tree from there, deeper and deeper to debug. So hopefully that's helpful. Obviously, the last thing is the user-facing experience, where you take the experience, the individual maps, and the loading screen, and you bundle those together to present in the UI. But the workhorse of this whole video hopefully encourages you to use the Lyra action sets a bit more, and to think a bit more about bundling things like input abilities and hiding them deeper into the chain from a debugging perspective. So thanks again. Appreciate you watching, and our next video will be the next step in our loot box for our 3v3 mode.